How far would you go to bring to justice those who have wronged someone you love? This is a somewhat common through line in a lot of movies, books, and games we've become accustomed to. However, what if I told you that a real-life, thrilling tale of Miriam Rodriguez, the toughest Mexican mother, took place in Mexico a few years ago? Stay tuned to this video to learn the story of this woman that vengefully hunted down 10 cartel members who killed her daughter. San Fernando. This takes place in the city of San Fernando, in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, a small community of about 60,000 inhabitants that, despite its size, holds a pretty infamous reputation. The fact is that Mexico is a nation known worldwide, not only for its historical sites, great food, and beautiful landscapes. Unfortunately, the country often gets associated with crime and violence, mostly due to the existence of its cartels. The presence of those organized crime families and gangs, such as La Familia, the Sinaloa, and Gulf cartels, help perpetuate criminality all across the nation, allegedly claiming the lives of 120,000 people in its long-running drug war. It comes as no surprise when you take a look at the latest murder rates in Mexico and see an increase in homicides from 2015 to 2021, with 26.6 deaths per 100,000 people, a 76.3% increase. This sums up to 34,000 victims of the entire Mexican population, which equates to 94 homicides a day in 2021 alone. As we can see, there was a small improvement in 2018 and 2019, but there's still a long way to go. Alongside high rates of corruption, trafficking, and kidnappings, all we can deduce is that Mexico is indeed one of the most dangerous countries to live in. The city of San Fernando in particular serves as a prime example of this harsh reality. Despite being located in a state with stunning beaches, renowned theater groups, and prosperous agricultural, chemical, and oil production industries, its outside is both entangled by a cluster of highways that lead to strategic border crossings with the United States, and dirt roads that provide numerous smuggling routes for traffickers. But on top of all of that, the city gained international attention for two major massacres that occurred in 2010 and 2011. Los Zetas. In 2010, after engaging in combat with some members of the Los Zetas cartel, federal authorities discovered the corpses of 14 women and 58 men stacked up inside a ranch on the city outskirts. The 72 victims were all Central American migrants taken as hostages by the criminals while trying to travel to the US. At the time, that was considered the most savage killing ever by a cartel. But only a year later, Los Zetas decided to attack once again and outdid themselves in a mass murder. In 2011, the members kidnapped several people via multiple bus hijackings. Women were sexually abused, and the men were forced to fight themselves to the death in gladiator style. Those who could stand victorious would be recruited by the group. The bodies were later dumped in several mass graves along San Fernando's peripheries. While a total of 193 corpses were found, the death toll is alleged to be much higher, according to a later captured member, who claimed to be around 600 people murdered. Those two terrible events, along with continued violence between the Los Zetas cartel and rival gangs, helps us to understand that living in San Fernando meant accepting a cruel reality. There, kidnappings and cartel-imposed curfews are as common as traffic and pollution in other cities. Families have their lives circumscribed by violence, suspicion, fear, and trauma. Not knowing anyone who has ever murdered or gone missing is a remarkable feat. But who exactly is the Los Zetas? Simply, one of the main causes for turning the city and state into a hopeless land with multiple assassinations, let alone political and police corruption, several prison breakouts, and a major exodus from the region over the past few years. The group originally consisted of former elite airborne special force members of the Mexican army who deserted to the Gulf cartel's drug trafficking organization and became its hired assassins. With that being said, one can see that despite being members of a trafficking organization, their main asset was not drug smuggling but organized violence. They quickly evolved from the military wing of the cartel to an organization of their own, generating profit from crimes such as fuel theft, extortion, human smuggling, piracy, and kidnapping. The group arguably inflicts much more terror and suffering on the Mexican population than the ones solely devoted to drug trafficking, not to mention that the recurrent dispute between the Los Zetas and other cartels and gangs only makes everything worse. The kidnapping. We have a proper context to where our story takes place, it's time to finally dive into it. Our protagonist, Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez, was born in 1960 in the city of San Fernando, where she grew up and lived with her family all her life. Unfortunately, to zero surprises, Miriam was one of the hundreds of mothers in the region who happened to be victims of the system. Her life took the darkest of turns when her 20-year-old daughter, Karen Alejandra, went missing in 2014. It all started in January 23rd, 2014, when Karen was driving and was prepared to merge into traffic traffic at an intersection. That was when 2 trucks filled with armed men pulled up beside her, stopping her. They forced their way inside her vehicle, grabbed Karen, and took off with her. They drove her to the family home, which was empty at that moment. Miriam happened to be away, since aside from owning a small cowboy apparel shop called Rodeo Boots, Ms. Rodriguez worked as a nanny in Texas. Inside the house, the men placed Karen on the living room floor, tied her up, and gagged her. That was when they heard someone knocking at the door. It was her uncle's mechanic, who was there to work on the family truck. Panicking over the unexpected situation, the kidnappers grabbed him alongside Karen and fled. But shortly after that, they decided to free the mechanic. That's because he wasn't the intended target. They just wanted Karen. The kidnappers then called the girl's parents and demanded the payment of a ransom. Miriam and her ex-husband agreed and proceeded to get a loan from the bank that, listen to this, offered lines of credit for such payments. Karen's father followed every demand made by the kidnappers. He dropped off a bag of cash near a health clinic and waited at the local cemetery for them to free Karen, but nothing happened. The point is that, sadly, that was just the first of many calls that followed the weeks after Karen's abduction. The kidnappers continued to ask for more money, threatening and making false promises to the family. Tired, desperate, and with little to lose, Miriam requested a meeting with Los Zetas, and to her surprise, they agreed to see her at a restaurant in town, the El Junior. Once there, Miriam met with a young man who claimed to be part of the group and begged him to return her daughter. The man, however, tried to spin the narrative. He kept saying that it wasn't his cartel that had taken Karen, but that he would assist Miriam in finding her for $2,000. Mrs. Rodriguez agreed. As she paid him, she couldn't help but notice a walkie-talkie hanging from the kidnapper's belt. The portable was buzzing repeatedly, and through the static, she could hear someone call him by the name of Sama. Both left, and after a week, he stopped answering the phone. Others called Miriam, claiming to be the kidnappers and demanding more money. Even doubting it probably wouldn't bring Karen back. The family continued to send money anyway. Hope is always the last thing to fade away from us in these extreme situations. Even being suspicious, Miriam couldn't help but fantasize about her daughter's return after every payment. But as they resulted in nothing, it was as if Miriam was being killed bit by bit, slowly falling into despair. At that time, Miriam had moved in with her older daughter, Azalea, and one morning, a few days after a new payment, Miriam finally understood. I mean, Mrs. Rodriguez had been a resident in San Fernando all her life. She was no stranger to the methods used by the cartels and knew that it was truly the Zetas who took her daughter. She just knew. She came downstairs, faced Azalea, and restrainedly told her that she knew Karen was never coming back, and that she was probably dead. However, instead of letting grief take over her, at that moment, Miriam swore to hunt down all the kidnappers, one by one. That she wouldn't rest until she found every single person who had taken her. Hearing her mother's words, Azalea was the witness to Miriam's transformation from a haggard and heartbroken woman to a relentless and vengeful mother. From that day on, Miriam was a different person. She would have justice. She would have revenge. And her hunt was only starting. A quantum leap. The fact is that, like everyone else living in San Fernando, Miriam was a mother scorned by the system. Miriam did attempt to do things the proper way, but that was a pointless effort. Her awful story had been ignored by the authorities, whose main responsibility would be to ensure justice and assist the population. Instead, the police and politicians were pretty much controlled and run by gangsters. And even if they weren't at the service of the cartels, they were most likely terrified to actually do their jobs. That said, Miriam began her mission by herself. The first step was to talk to the family's mechanic, who had also been taken with Karen. Since he was released from the gang, Miriam was able to question him about what he saw and what he heard. It was through this questioning that Miriam reaffirmed the existence of a gang member named Sama and confirmed his involvement in Karen's kidnapping. She then rushed to social media. I mean, I think that nowadays we're all familiar with many of the harms that the internet causes us, but it undoubtedly has its advantages. It is surely the only place where you can find anything and anyone you want. It was then easy to deduce that a member of the infamous Los Zetas cartel couldn't help but show off his rather lavish lifestyle, rather than attempting to hide and maintain anonymity. After all, this was Mexico. Miriam then became a true detective, spending hours inspecting and scouring Facebook profiles in search of clues. One day, she was able to find a picture tagged with the name Sama on social media and immediately recognized him. That was indeed the cartel member she had met. The same slim figure and well-groomed face. In the picture, there was a young woman standing beside him. She was wearing an ice cream store's uniform from a shop a couple of hours away from her home in Ciudad Victoria, the capital of Tamaulipas. The hunt. Over the next few weeks, Miriam walked to the store, noting down the girl's entire routine. She kept doing so until Sama eventually showed up one day. When that happened, she tailed them as they made their way home. And now, Miriam knew their address, but she needed more. To mobilize the authorities and force them to act, she needed names. And to do so, she needed to get close. Because Sama knew Miriam, she had to change her appearance so he wouldn't recognize her. She then cut her hair and dyed it red. After taking a government uniform she had kept from a low-level job at the health ministry and a fake ID, she came up with the perfect perfect disguise. Miriam proceeded to conduct a fake poll on the neighborhood until she eventually spoke to them and was able to get details over one of her daughter's captors. With this new information, Miriam went back to the authorities, but still found resistance. There were some investigators who insinuated there wasn't any criminal evidence of kidnapping and that her daughter had probably escaped on her own. However, she eventually found a federal policeman who gave her a chance. When she pulled her files onto the table, I had never seen anything like it, claims the officer, who is still active but wasn't allowed to speak publicly. The details and information gathered by this woman, working all alone, were incredible. She had gone to every single level of government and they had slammed the door in her face. To help her hunt down the people who took her daughter, it was the greatest privilege of my career. But frustratingly enough, when Miriam finally received some cooperation and the arrest warrant had been issued, Summer went out of town, but not for long. In the meantime, Miriam was able to find his social media and started tracking the rest of the criminals. It was then September 15th, 2014, when Mexican Independence Day celebrations started. Luis, Miriam's son, was able to close down his shop in Ciudad Victoria to attend the festivities, when one last customer showed up, a slim, young, and well-groomed man who was browsing some headwear. Luis took a look at the fellow and recognized him. It was Sama. Luis immediately called his mother and followed Sama until the police arrived. Sama was arrested in the city's central plaza and taken into custody. He was interrogated and without much resistance started to give up a few names and crucial locations for the case. One of those accomplices was Cristian Jose Zapada Gonzalez, properly referred to by crime articles as the Kid, given he is barely 18 years old. Christian was visibly scared during his interrogation. He continually asked to see his mother and claimed that he was hungry, because once a mother, always a mother. Miriam walked into the room and gave her lunch to the boy. When the officer asked her why she did that, Miriam answered, "He is still a child, no matter what he did, and I am still a mother. When I heard him just now, it was like my own child." Probably touched by the act of kindness, the young boy let it all out. "I'm willing to take you to the ranch where they killed them and where their bodies should be buried," he said. And so he did. The search. The site indicated by Christian was an abandoned ranch in the middle of nowhere. Its landscape was rather unsettling. An old busted tractor down a dirt path marked the site of a burial. A noose hung nearby from a tree. Bullet holes from a shootout between the cartel members and Mexican Marines marked the outer walls of a small house. A frightful number of bones, of all shapes and sizes, right next to a pile of victims' personal belongings. Trying to find any leads, Miriam's heart stopped when she found Karen's scarf and her truck seat cushion, which she instantly recognized. A later analysis claimed that Karen was not among the identified bodies at the ranch, but Miriam didn't believe that and showed incredible strength as she stood up to get the truth. She had to wait a whole year when scientists at last were able to find a piece of Karen's femur. At once, Miriam finally was able to place her daughter to rest. Exhausted, Miriam drove back home from that ranch that day. On the way, she passed through a barbecue near the entrance of the dirt road that led to the site. She then remembered that not only did she know the place, having eaten with Azalea only 2 days after the kidnapping, but most importantly, on that same day, she met a neighbor she knew very well there, Elvia Yulisa Betancourt. Miriam was acquainted with Elvia for a long time, since she was a child abandoned by a sex-working mother. Out of charity and goodwill, Miriam always helped her with what she could, donating some of Karen's old clothes to her. On the day she and Azalea ate there, Miriam approached Elvia, who was by herself, and asked if she knew anything about Karen. Elvia played off, apparently not knowing what had happened. However, considering that by that time everyone knew, Miriam thought that was odd. But it was only at that moment, driving by the restaurant, that Miriam realized that maybe Elvia knew something, or even worse, that she could be involved in Karen's homicide. Filled with rage by the possibility of such a betrayal, Miriam raced home and continued her research. She didn't take long to discover a new piece of precious information. Betancourt was apparently in a relationship with one of Karen's kidnappers, who was in prison for another crime. Seeking revenge, Miriam stalked her out and waited for long weeks outside of the prison where Elvia's boyfriend was locked up. When Betancourt finally showed up during visiting hours to see him, Miriam called the police. Elvia was then arrested, and after some investigations, authorities affirmed that some of the dozens of ransom calls made to Miriam's family came from her house. It's open season 2017. By that time, Miriam had already undergone 3 years of her mission to hunt down every living member of the group who killed her daughter. She could call herself a true investigator by now, and even gained respect from some officers. Her hunt was widely known. It's hard not to admire such willpower and strength coming from such a lady. In a country taken down by organized crime, where no one, not even the authorities, were brave enough to challenge the system, let alone put such criminals behind bars, Miriam took matters into her own hands, and through sheer force of will, terrorized the lives of members of one of the most notorious notorious gangs in the nation, proving that justice could and should always be served, be it by stalking criminals online, interrogating court accomplices, taking on disguises, impersonating political figures, manipulating her appearance, befriending unsuspecting relatives for possible leads, and even uncovering a massacre. Miriam Rodriguez was unstoppable. After Betancourt's arrest, time flew by, as Miriam went on gathering more and more information. Some of the kidnappers were already paying for what they'd done. Many tried to start a new life after the occurrence, be it as taxi drivers or car salesmen, gas delivery people, a babysitter, even a born-again Christian. But from all of Miriam's gallery of captures, the most memorable one has to be her hunt after a gangster turned florist. The florist, one of Karen's kidnappers, had since been selling flowers near the Texas border. It was early in the morning when Miriam received a tip of his whereabouts from a widow. I don't think I have to say that Miriam immediately followed it. Wearing a trench coat over her pajamas, a baseball cap to hide her now iconic red hair, and hiding a gun in her purse, she headed to the border and eventually found him on the bridge. But as she got closer, the florist recognized her and, may I say so, ridiculously started to run from our 56-year-old hero. He sprinted along the pedestrian pass, but Miriam was able to catch up. She then not only grabbed him by the shirt, but wrestled him to the ground and pinned him at gunpoint. Her handgun was placed right at the back of his head. "If you move, I'll shoot you," she said, as they waited for the police to arrive and take him away. La Madre Activista. As mentioned earlier, it is safe to say that during her quest, Miriam surely gained a lot of admirers, and just as many enemies. After 3 years, it was expected that leads eventually would start to fade and become more and more scarce. That is why, instead of losing hope and wasting her energy, Miriam proved why she was one of a kind. Alongside her investigation, she started an organization to help support families that were victims of kidnappings, called the Vanished Collective. The organization was made up of over 600 families, united by not only supporting each other, but through active teamwork, committing to finding missing family members. The organization was made up of over 600 families, united by not only supporting each other, but through active teamwork, committing to finding missing family members. Those families, also frustrated by the lack of support from the government, started to make their own investigations into the search of their relatives. It didn't matter if they had to face organized crime or drug trafficking mafia. Inspired by Miriam, they went out and even got to enroll in forensic anthropology and law courses, bought excavation equipment, and became experts in identifying graves and bones. Miriam's actions truly proved to the Mexican population that there should be no place for impunity, and each one of us can make a difference. In a country where 100,000 people died in cases of violence related to drug trafficking in the last decade, and 30,000 others went missing under suspicious circumstances in 2016, with Tamaulipas gathering 5,563 of those, it's not hard to understand that the Mexicans were way over this situation. And when someone such as Miriam emerged with such a fantastic feat against all odds, it sure was a very inspiring and moving aptitude that gave the Mexicans a bit of hope. Maybe there is indeed a place for justice in this world. However, as I said earlier, the same campaign that made Miriam famous and loved by so many also turned her into a vulnerable target. She and her family often received death threats, as her acts weren't merely a menace to a few isolated kidnappers. Instead, Miriam became a threat to the entire criminal system that ruled San Fernando, as she flouted unspoken rules of business, disrupting an unnatural order. Worried, the family often asked the government for protection, fearing that Miriam could have gone too far. To such claims, she responded, "I don't care if they kill me. I died the day they killed my daughter. I'm going to take out the people who hurt my daughter, and they can do whatever they want to me." A mom's farewell on Mother's Day. Then, the inevitable happened. In March of 2017, 24 prisoners escaped the penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria, where Karen's killers had been put. Fearing the worst, Miriam once again requested protection from the government, asking for armed guards, but to no surprise, she was ignored. Miriam's family was as apprehensive as ever, but she still had one last target to take care of, a young girl who was working as a nanny for a family in Ciudad Victoria. After spending various days and nights outside the family's home where she worked, the police eventually arrested the woman outside the house. However, as the police arrived, Miriam tripped when she ran towards them with excitement. The result? Miriam fractured her foot and had to wear a cast and use crutches for the following weeks. And then, on the 10th of May 2017, that year's Mother's Day, Miriam's story came to an end. At 10:21 p.m., she returned home to the house Karen stayed at, which she was sharing with her ex-husband. She parked on the street and slowly got out of her car due to her injury. That was when a white truck filled with prison escapees pulled up behind her and fired 13 times at Miriam. Her death caused massive outrage and an outpouring of support, both in Mexico and internationally, irrationally. The Office of the Human Rights Commission of Mexico accused the government of failing to protect the population and militants of the humanitarian cause. They went on to request precautionary measures for Miriam's family and members of the vanished collective. State Attorney Irving Barrios told a news conference at the time that Miriam's security was being controlled by the police as officers made rounds at her home 3 times a day. This information, however, has always been questioned by the family. The United Nations mission in Mexico strongly condemned the killing, while Amnesty International demanded Miriam's murder to be investigated independently, impartially, and thoroughly. Members of the vanished collective also spoke up to ask international organizations to take a more active role in the grim Tamaulipas scenario, and that Miriam's death could not go unpunished. Surprisingly enough, even the local government finally decided to take some action and work to bring Miriam's killers to justice. 2 of them got arrested, and 1 was killed in a gunfight. Those who ordered her murder, though, remain loose and unknown. Miriam was later buried next to her daughter Karen. In the end, after all she had endured to avenge her daughter, Miriam was finally able to reunite with her in the afterlife. A lifelong legacy. Miriam may not be around with us anymore, but by dedicating the last years of her life to fighting the impunity that shapes and engulfs her entire country, Miriam became a symbol of the fight for justice. Her quest didn't exactly end with her. A month after her death, some information that she'd provided helped officials to locate and arrest a woman responsible for torturing Karen during the kidnapping. After the crime, she fled to Veracruz, where she started working as a taxi driver to make a living. But even hiding 500 miles away, there was no way she could escape the toughest mother in all of Mexico. Miriam's story ultimately represents everything that is wrong in Mexico, but also the perseverance of its people in the face of the government's indifference and impunity. The mother who was only trying to solve the abduction of her daughter and died violently because of it will be forever remembered in San Fernando and beyond. Even with the vanished collective later falling apart and crime rates on a continuous rise, Miriam's actions were never in vain. They showed us that in the face of adversity, there is always hope. In the face of corruption, there is always rightness. Be it by her fierce townspeople, by the collective groups that were formed all around Mexico after her death, or even by movies inspired by her extraordinary and in itself cinematic mission to justice, Miriam's influence lives on. The protagonist of an incredible life story, Miriam Rodriguez was a true force that could only be stopped by being gunned down in the street in a cowardly attack. Even when she was full of anger, she maintained her morals and believed in a better world where one day children could fearlessly grow up. And for as long as we can keep her flame lit, there is hope that more and more Miriams will emerge, so that once and for all, the whole world can flourish in harmony. And what about you? Can you now answer the question we posed at the start of this video? How far would you go to avenge the ones you love? If you like this content, make sure to click on one of the cards on the screen to watch more.